Well, I'm always looking for new video ideas, and I just shot a video on understanding transition points a few minutes ago, and I was thinking, hey, that just brought an idea about understanding noses. I have right now been working on, as the editor-in-chief of this non-Caucasian face journal for this month, and I was editing all these papers on Middle Eastern noses, African American noses, Asian noses, and it really got to the point where actually I saw these authors have very similar perspective than I do, and I want to share those ideas with you. I'm not going to get really into great details about this, but I do want to sort of share some concepts I think are very important. The first concept is when we're working with an ethnic nose that we're actually sensitive to their cultural standards, because when we obliterate a bridge in a Middle Eastern nose, or we over pinch down an African American nose or an Asian nose, or really raise the bridge too high in an Asian nose, we don't create a Caucasian, we create an alien. And I think that is something that doesn't quite fit their facial features, and so the standard should not be just a Western or Caucasian nose to say, hey, just because it's a Caucasian, that must look good, and we must make the nose look someone like this blonde model. And so we want to really make sure that we understand cultural sensitivity when we're talking about noses. I'm not going to talk about every subtle point, but I want to just touch upon some differences for Hispanic, Asian, African, and Middle Eastern noses, so you can understand sort of what's so important in terms of cultural preservation. Let's go through each one of those. An Asian nose. An Asian nose, I think one of the biggest problems is a bridge that's too high. The radix point right here, which is a start point of the nose, should start in Caucasians roughly at the crease or above the eyelash level. I think that's relatively too high for most Asians. I start my break point somewhere around the mid-pupil, around, if you're looking from a side view, where the pupil starts. And I think that a lot of Asian noses that are a bit blunted and flat start pretty low down at the lower part of the eye. So I usually like to raise it about halfway up the eye. So that's just one concept that I think is really important. I'm not going to go through the details of how to do each nose. I think it's just too long a video. I just want to express to you cultural preservation ideas for each of the ethnicities. Let's actually talk about the opposite type of nose, which would be a Middle Eastern nose. Very strong radix, very high bridge, tends to be a much stronger profile than the Asian nose. The problem I see, the number one problem in this case, is the exact opposite of the Asian nose, which is lowering the bridge too much. So I see Middle Eastern faces that have a certain characteristic Middle Eastern look, and then the doctor goes, oh yeah, I just want this little button nose, so they take down the bridge all the way down, take the radix way down, take the whole dorsum of the bridge way, way down, and they got this really pinched, tight little tip that looks really ridiculous on them. And so what is so important on a Middle Eastern nose is to talk in the preoperative session about preservation of the ethnic bridge height. Really, really, really important in my opinion. So something just to think about. African American noses have a sort of a hybrid. They tend to have more of a flared nose, a flatter bridge, and so the temptation is to go, let's go and just pull those nostrils way in, because classic understanding of where this area should be is that it should be roughly where the eye stops, and that's too narrow oftentimes for an African American nose. It looks just way too small, and then you start creating disharmony where the nose looks a bit pinched and the shape doesn't look natural. So oftentimes, to make this look smaller, instead of pinching it in, just make the tip a little bit more projected, and the balance between tip to the sides will make the African American nose look about proportionate. Sometimes you need to do some degrees of alar base reduction or reduction of the sides. I'm not going to talk to you about all the types of way to do that. That's actually probably another good video to do. But it's just the idea of don't over pinch this in. I think it's a number one mistake in an African nose. The other problem with it is the African Platyrrhine nose, which is the description of the type of nose for Africans. By the way, the Asians have what's called mesorrhine noses, and then the Caucasians have leptorrhine noses. But for the platyrrhine, or African nose, the bones, nasal bones, are quite flared and strong and wide. And the mistake that I've seen is trying to tell someone that bone is going to go really tiny and small. It just, where the bone sits to the skin, it just is hard to reduce it significantly. So for that reason too, is that if you over pinch this area in, the bridge will look too flared. So another concept between understanding sort of culturally sensitive ideas for each race. The Hispanic nose is probably the most difficult nose to deal with. Not deal with, but to comprehend. And the reason is that the concept of the mestizo nose. And what mestizo means essentially is mixture. It's an admixture of different races. For example, the Caribbean slave trade that went through the sugar trade through Cuba, various components like Haiti, Dominican Republic, you have much, much darker skinned people. So when you talk about Hispanic in that case, you're almost talking about African because they have a predominance of African features. So you're really looking at an African nose when you're dealing with people from that portion of the world. People that come from Incan or Peruvian or Central American or Mexican indigenous, they look more Asian because the Asians that crossed over the Bering Strait eons ago and have settled in those areas, there is more of an Asian feature, thicker skin, broader noses, flatter noses that look more like Asians. So if you're dealing with someone, for example, certain Mexicans that may have been, that haven't mixed with a lot of the white colonialists, et cetera, which is the next topic, they tend to have more Asian features. So you want to respect that. And then some of the strategies we talked about for Asian nose becomes more important. And then finally, if you think about some of the white colonialists and also just the people that are here, for example, the American settlers, all of that white interbreeding with all these different types of races makes the mestizo nose a very complicated nose. And so what you're doing is to understand which of the components predominate. Is it primarily a white nose? Then you would probably treat it more toward the white lines. Is it a nose that primarily is more of a Asian origin or indigenous, American, Native American look, or is it something that has more of African root? And if it's a combination, then you've got to discuss with that patient some of pulling all those philosophical points together. So hopefully this was not a technical talk about how to create noses. That's going to be a much lengthier video. But I just wanted to introduce some concepts behind how I judge a nose in terms of a cultural context, globally speaking, because today I think there's also, remember the other idea is not just Hispanic, but there's multicultural, there's multiracial. There are people that are whites that have married Africans, or Africans have married Asians, etc. And that intermarriage, then you have noses that are very, very different, also faces that are very different. But in this video, we're just specifically talking about noses. So I hope that video was not an interesting nose, but an interesting video for you to think about some of the cultural sensitivities I think we really need to preserve and enhance rather than ablate or efface.